Okay, everyone, welcome. And we are so excited to be joining you virtually at the No Studios Social Justice Summit today. We are delighted to be having a conversation today around the campaign From Fairness to Freedom, Universal Representation, and the fight for immigrant justice. Today, I'm joined by some incredible leaders who have been fighting for and winning universal representation at the state level for many years, building the building blocks for a larger federal push so that every person facing our unjust immigration system will have access to counsel and can navigate this process knowing they have a high quality attorney standing by their side and a federally funded attorney at that. I'm thrilled today that our conversation will really be highlighting local victories for publicly defunded deportation defense, but also that have been building and coinciding with victories to end detention, limit immigration enforcement across the country, and expand protections for all communities during the pandemic and beyond. This is a growing movement for universal representation. When we launched this campaign the end of April, we were joined by over 120 organizations across the country and local officials and partners calling for federal action to establish legal representation for all. I'm your host today, Nicole Malaku, Executive Director of the National Partnership for New Americans. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you today from beautiful Denver, Colorado. I'm thrilled to be joined by today's panelists that include Kika Matos, the Vice President of Initiatives at Vera Institute for Justice, Aisa Olivares, Managing Attorney for Community Immigration Law Center, Murad Awadeh, Executive Director from the New York Immigrant Coalition, and Laura Martin, Executive Director of the Progressive Leadership Alliance of Nevada, or PLAN. Today, we want to share highlights of the victories that have been building over the last 2 decades that are bringing us to this moment. And we're going to make a call to action for all of you to join us in advancing a federal campaign for universal representation. So without further ado, I would love to begin with each of our panelists, sharing a little bit more about yourself, the history of your engagement in this work, and why this campaign and why this work of advancing universal rep is so important to your organizations at the state level. So first, of course, being that we are hosted virtually by our friends and colleagues in Milwaukee, I'm going to turn it over to Aisa and want you to give us a local context of what you've been building there and share why it's so critical that people have access to a lawyer while facing our immigration system. So Aisa, join us and welcome.
Hello, Nicole, and I'm very honored to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Good afternoon. I'm the managing attorney at the Community Immigration Law Center, Aisa Olivares, she, her, hers, Aya, joining in from Madison, Wisconsin. And the Community Immigration Law Center is a small nonprofit with very powerful attorneys. We're small but powerful, with many volunteers as well who support our detention project and this universal representation model that we started to implement back in 2017. We work alongside the Immigrant Justice Clinic at the University of Wisconsin Law School to serve people detained in Wisconsin at the Dodge County Detention Facility. We were a part of the first cohort of organizations supported by the Vera Institute of Justice through the SAFE network. And I know that as a lawyer, I can get stuck in the day-to-day of filings, research, writing. But when I step back and I see the impact that this work has made in our community so far, specifically in the area of Dane County, I see that it sends an inclusive message and a message of belonging to our immigrant community. In spite of the racist immigration policies that people faced on a day-to-day basis, this work in universal representation is a step toward justice. So really proud to be a part of the work that has been done so far in Dane County and in Wisconsin, and really looking forward to supporting the efforts being launched at a federal level.
Thank you so much, Aisa. Now I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed colleague, Kika Matos, Vice President of Initiatives at Vera Institute for Justice. Kika, I know you're going to share more about some of the work that the Safe Cities really has built over the last 20 years to advance this idea and framework across the country. I'd love for you to, of course, introduce yourself and the work of Vera and share a little bit about why universal representation is so critical in this moment.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. It's good to see everybody. Greetings from New Haven, Connecticut, where it finally feels like summer is right around the corner. Vera has been steeped in the movement to fight for lawyers to for people facing detention for almost 2 decades. We started off piloting a project for the federal government focused on legal orientation for people in detention, and fast forward almost 20 years later, we administer a number of federal programs focused on access to justice for some of the most vulnerable immigrants in this country. And by that, I mean particularly people in detention. We administer the unaccompanied children's program, which really focuses on making sure that the most vulnerable kids have access to lawyers. We administer what's known as the NQRP, the National Qualified Representation Program, that focuses on vulnerable immigrants who have mental health conditions, and again, trying to make sure that they have access to lawyers. We also administer the Legal Orientation Program, which is really focused on making sure that every single person in detention in the United States has information about the US legal system and what they should expect. 5 years ago, we launched SAFE, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And that's really been part of our efforts to build a true movement for universal representation. Before Vera, I just want to quickly mention that I was very much a part of movement building efforts at the national level. Nicole, that's how we have, I think, developed a great friendship, and also have been able to collaborate around this idea and this demand for a need to completely revamp the immigration system in this country as we know it, because depending on who you talk to, it's either deeply broken or it's working the way that it's designed to work, which is deeply problematic.
Thank you so much, Kika. Now I'm going to turn it over to our next guest, Murad, from the New York Immigrant Coalition. Murad, I would love for you to share a little bit of NYC's work in this area and some of the successes that you've built over the years. And we'll get in a little bit deeper throughout our conversation, but maybe just why this matters so much to NYC.
No, thank you so much, Nicole, for having me. And thank you to being in space and community with all the other panelists who are doing amazing work across this country. The New York Immigration Coalition is the largest statewide immigrant and refugee rights coalition in the United States, with over 200 members across our amazing state, from Buffalo down to Brooklyn to the East End and Long Island. We work to protect and expand and defend the rights of immigrant communities, improve access for newcomers, develop leadership and capacity, as well as expand civic engagement and mobilize member groups to respond to the needs of our communities by advocating for progressive policies on the city, municipal, local, state, and federal level. Most recently, we won municipal voting rights for immigrants in New York City who have permanent resident status, or at the very least, work authorization. And this will result in the largest expansion of voting rights in our country in the last 50 years. And this is going to enfranchise nearly 1 million people in the New York City area. New York State was, in fact, the first to introduce the Access to Representation bill in state legislature and to begin to move that work. And we've been working with Vera in partnership to really move this work forward. We were able to do this with a certain amount of confidence because we have built the support around the need for legal services funding amongst our state legislature and amongst New Yorkers. And that work needs to happen in tandem and together. This year, in fact, New York State's budget, which was just passed in April, allocates a significant increase in funding for legal services. We were able to secure $20 million in immigration legal services, the largest investment we've seen at the state level. We've successfully communicated to electeds that immigrant New Yorkers are integral community members and that the state must fight for all of its constituents if they vote for them or not. We've also argued that in the face of inaction, at best, and virtual horrific anti-immigrant activity at the worst, federally, New York has to step up and fund legal services to keep our families together and our communities strong. The pandemic provided further proof of just how essential immigrant workers are to New York State. So for us, this sets the stage to move a legislative bill forward on this issue. Just to highlight one of our champions, I do want to highlight our access to representation bill champion, as well as immigrant community champion, Assemblywoman Catalina Cruz, who speaks powerfully about how she grew up as a dreamer, undocumented, lived in the United States for more than 10 years as an undocumented American, and then was able to obtain legal help. And then through that status, now she became an attorney. She represented immigrants in immigration court. She went on to fight against wage theft, worked in government, and now is representing one of the most diverse assembly districts in the state of New York. This just shows what happens when we build power and political power of immigrants who understand firsthand the struggles and priorities of our communities.
Thank you so much, Murad. And now we're going to move to the Mountain West and closer to my part of the country here. Our neighbors in Nevada, and under the leadership of Laura and groups like PLAN, have really advanced this idea of universal representation and have been fighting to achieve this at the state level on many fronts, along with other partners. Welcome, Laura. I'd love for you to share a little bit about the work that PLAN is doing to advance the idea of universal rep, and maybe give us a little flavor of what it's like to organize in a high stakes political environment such as Nevada.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for the invite to be part of this discussion. I am calling in from fabulous Las Vegas and happy to be here with all of you watching. So PLAN, the Progressive Leadership Alliance in Nevada, was founded in 1994 as a coalition. Our members are other institutions like SCIU, the ACLU, and also smaller organizations like Gender Justice Nevada. And we organize in coalition to ensure that regardless if our state house or city hall is so-called red or blue, at least the people have a chance at winning. And so we organize in coalition because we know we don't live our lives in silos. And so we can't organize in that way either. So in 2006, we co-founded the Nevada Immigrant Coalition with labor partners, immigrant partners, all types of organizations who are accountable to a base that includes immigrants, refugees, and undocumented people. We still are part of the steering committee of the Nevada Immigrant Coalition and are proud to see it continue to grow and continue to be the organization that has prevented any anti-immigrant legislation from not only passing, but in most cases, even getting a hearing in our legislature. Our coalitions away from NIC do a lot of electoral work, and that includes ensuring that we're talking to our members so that our electorate in 1994, when PLAN was founded, was 90% white. And now our electorate has completely changed, and so has the faces of the people who are being elected, which has helped us pass legislation, including passing at the county level funding for universal representation. And I think part of the question I was going to be asked about the quick success, and I know sometimes it can feel like, oh, it just happened so fast, but this is something that we've worked on for a while. And I believe with the election of Donald Trump, it became an understood urgency where some people felt maybe we didn't need to do this, do that. I think then everyone understood the only way to keep people in this country is by providing them with attorneys. And I don't think enough people realize that immigrants are expected to go before a judge, even children, without guaranteed representation. We just find that completely unacceptable. And so that was a way that we were building power and letting people know that you belong here, that the very fact of just being an immigrant isn't enough to be deported. And we also works in coalition with a group called Mass Liberation. We help administer the Vegas Freedom Fund, which is our only bail fund, and we have Ariba Las Vegas that has the state's only immigration bond fund. And those are also ways that we fight to keep families together. But the universal representation money that we won, $1 million, that was the first time this ever happened in the state, and it's pretty significant because Nevada doesn't have state taxes. We don't have corporate taxes. We don't have capital gains, so it's not like it's a budget we can pull from. You know, we barely have enough money to subsidize childcare in the state. And so being able to win this victory was a huge benefit to our state. And it's possible because of the strength of coalition members here in the state, but also organizations like VERA and NPNA and FIRM who had our backs and helped us with research, and able to make, you know, what was once our dream now a reality.
Thank you, Laura. So that's a perfect segue. I mean, I think many of us, every single one of us here that are speaking on the panel, had some role in lifting up our local UREP, fighting for and building electoral power in order to make that dream a reality in our states and in our various localities. And so it's really great to like kind of come back to the root, right, of how we're going to build a federal plan for this. So Kika, moving back to the bigger vision around universal representation. Can you share a little bit about what we mean in the campaign and in this work when we are saying universal representation? And how does this idea fit into some of the larger immigration reform efforts, given what's on the table for all of our communities?
Yeah, thank you for those two questions, Nicole. The first thing I will say about our campaign, it's called Fairness to Freedom, Campaign for Universal Representation. What do we mean by universal? We mean everybody, right? And particularly given how deeply racist the system is and how often Black and Brown people are impacted unfairly, both by the criminal legal system and the immigration system. We want to make sure that those who are uniquely impacted in the worst possible way have access to lawyers. So when we say universal representation, we're being very explicit to everybody that we don't mean cherry picking, right? Looking for the cases that are sexy and that are winnable. We are saying we demand that every single person who is in deportation proceedings or facing the wrath of the immigration system should have the right to not just any lawyer, but a lawyer who is going to fiercely advocate on their behalf and who's not going to be unduly burdened or influenced by any political system. So universal representation means if you are an immigrant and you are facing deportation, you should have the right to a lawyer who's going to focus on fiercely advocating for you. To your question about why this, and look, there have been some questions from both allies and adversaries saying, why this, right? Our system is broken. Why are you picking a universal representation out of all of the things that we could be doing? I would say the answer is really simple, and that is that having a lawyer really matters. And we know that having a lawyer matters because we have the data to prove it. And let me just quickly go over some statistics. The research says that that people with lawyers are 3.5 times more likely to be granted bond and to be released from detention, and 10.5 times more likely to win in court, right? So that means if you have a lawyer and you have a deportation case, the chances of you proving that you have a right to remain in the United States increases tenfold with a lawyer, right? Let me go back and say a little bit about this framing as well, because I really want to be clear that we believe that the system is broken and we have to build something new, right? But our approach to this is that we're attacking it from this front, from one of many fronts. And we believe that having a lawyer is one of the most powerful weapons that a person has to fight for their deportation. Our partnership around the Fairness to Freedom comes at this time because we have worked really hard to build what I call a movement for universal representation. And we have heard some of the local efforts already shared in this panel. Right now, we have built this movement to the extent that there are almost 60 deportation defense programs that exist around the country. To break it down really simply, in 11 states, right, we have 60 different programs that are specifically focused on making sure that people facing deportation have access to good lawyers. And through the safe work, we have stood up 25 of these programs, and these programs are a partnership with three what I call a three-legged stool. Right, the deportation defense programs include government officials, they include lawyers, and they include grassroots organizations as well as impacted families. We believe this combination of these three critical players are what we think has seeded the movement for universal representation. We are now taking it up a notch and really demanding through the Fairness to Freedom campaign that we have Congress pass a law that mandates at the federal level, again, that everybody who is facing deportation should have a right to really good lawyers. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kika. I think that's really important to underscore, the connection of this work to the larger immigrant rights work, and that this is one part of that that builds and aligns with other parts that many folks in our movement are advancing, while we're also moving forward the movement for universal rep. So I'm going to take us to New York next, to Murad again, and I think kind of digging in a little bit deeper. Tell me more about the organizing and advancing your state priorities to end detention, limit ICE enforcement, and other priorities that your coalition is leading. And how do you message all of those intersections, and how you build organizing around that, which is what I hope people take away, regardless of where they're joining us from today.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And one piece to this puzzle that tends to be forgotten or missed is that a lot of our work happens locally with our membership. And it's the local victories that actually help us propel a state victory, and then the state victories help us propel the national victories. So for us, we've been combating myths about the inherent criminality of immigrants, which are at the center of our unjust immigration system. And those have contributed to the over-policing and over-incarceration of communities of color, with Black immigrants and migrants particularly vulnerable. So when we end the collusion of local law enforcement and ICE, we interrupt the arrest to deportation pipeline. When we end detention, we fight against the violence and the abuse rampant in these facilities that do nothing more than contribute to stereotypes of immigrants as criminals. And when immigrants have lawyers in immigration court, we treat them with the dignity that they deserve as New Yorkers, and we give them a fighting chance to navigate our complicated legal system and remain with their families and contributing to their communities. Before we kicked off the Access to Representation campaign, we had successfully already secured a little bit over $60 million in local funding for immigration legal services. And that helped us illustrate to the state that this fight is worth investing in. This fight is their duty to take part in, and that everyone has the right to due process. And we know that access to representation within the inherently unjust criminal, legal, and immigration systems will not by itself fix those systems, right? So we're not saying that universal representation or access to representation will undo all of the harm that these systems, flex onto our communities. But what the access to representation would provide is a measure of due process, fairness, and access to justice for immigrants facing deportation proceedings. And that in itself undermines the state's support for detention and deportation And at the same time, we're pursuing other solutions like the Dignity Not Detention Act that would ensure that New York's immigrant communities can live in dignity and freedom and help stop the detention system within the state of New York.
Thanks, Murad. Moving to Nevada, Laura, kind of the same question. I mean, when we look back almost 10 years ago, there were a handful of publicly funded deportation defense programs. As Kika said, now there's over 50 jurisdictions across the country, including Nevada and Clark County. And so can you share a little bit about how, your organizing has really kind of helped build the movement in Nevada for this and how that will intersect with sort of the larger national federal push?
Yeah, I can't stress enough how important it is to be in coalition with other organizations, labor, even teachers unions, women's rights organizations, because immigration touches all aspects of our communities. And so being able to humanize these stories, I think story banking seems so simple, but it is so important. And it's so meaningful. We can do all of the polling and statistics we can. There's a lot of experts who can do that, but what brings it to life is the real people who are affected by broken laws and bad decisions of the people who set up the way our immigration courts are even set up. And so it's important to do the base building, to do the work, and to do the story banking, to bring those to our decision makers, and also to bring those to people who are in positions of power to understand this. And in Nevada, I like to somewhat compare it to our fight for automatic restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated folks. In 2014 is when Plan first presented the idea of this legislation. In 2014, it was the Democratic Party saying no because it would make them look soft on crime. And so we did the work with our coalition partners to build a base of formerly incarcerated people who can talk about all of the different ways they've lost their right to vote, even marijuana convictions. And now marijuana is legal in Nevada, the same as it is in Colorado. And so just talking about the unfairness, because people like to think you lost your right to vote because you're Charles Manson. We know that's not true. These are our family members. These are people in our community. And so people tend to think someone was deported because they're bad, they are an evil person, they shouldn't be in our community. But people are being deported in places like Clark County, where traffic tickets are criminal because their license plates tags were expired, or because they were driving without a seatbelt. And that's a mistake that citizens make all the time. And we don't get a punishment that is, in a way, permanent. Sometimes it's hard to come back from that and try to be a citizen at another point in time. And so I think I cannot understate enough the power of people's stories. And that really requires people to build these strong coalitions and do that story collection, because over time, people's minds change. At one point, people thought we would never automatically restore the rights of folks. At one point, people thought we would never raise enough money for universal representation. And now we went from $0 to $1 million, and we're able to support the UNLV Immigration Clinic, who's been instrumental in stopping the deportations of so many people who needed representation, including children and people who are under the age of 18. And so organizing is hard. It's not easy. These wins take a long time, but when you do win, it feels so good because it's worth it. When all the pieces come together, when your coalition is able to see the hard work come to fruition, it's really worth it.
Thank you so much, Laura. And speaking of people, Asa, I'd love, you talked about paperwork and being in the process with individuals. Why would this make such a difference in people's, interaction with the immigration system? I'm sure you've heard the stories. And as Laura mentioned, people who, are interacting with the system with no kind of orientation to what all of this is going to mean. Can you share a little bit of some of the anecdotes from the ground and also some of the challenges that you think you've experienced there in the Midwest and in advancing this idea?
Yes, definitely. So as my colleagues here in the panel have mentioned, the stakes are incredibly high when you walk into immigration court. Facing deportation, facing permanent separation from your family, from the life that you've built in this country and in our community. A lot of people don't know that when you're detained, for example, and you're deported from detention, you have no chance to make arrangements for anything, for your belongings, to say goodbye. So this is a very high stakes issue, a very high stakes legal process. And I remember from my time with ProBar, when I first started doing immigration work, walking into a courtroom for the first time with a child. A lot of people don't realize when you go in there that you are in front of a judge and that you're sitting right across from legal counsel from the Department of Homeland Security. And so that is a trained lawyer that you're going up against pro se. And you're fighting for your right to stay here in the community with your family. So understanding those legal standards is very high stakes. And I know during our first year launching the universal representation model here in Dane County, we met a green card holder who was detained after receiving a criminal conviction for a criminal plea here in Dane County, and ICE arrested him and transferred him to the Dodge County facility in Juneau, Wisconsin, where we met him. And at the time, his wife was 8 months pregnant. And unfortunately, he missed the birth of his fifth child because he was sitting in detention. And this case took a heavy amount of research and writing and consulting with colleagues in Wisconsin, with the Brooklyn Defenders Program, with Vera, because the statute that he was convicted under had to be very carefully analyzed. And at the time, we also had wraparound services, making sure that the family was okay during this time that this my client was in detention. And so, we argued successfully in front of the immigration judge, and we won his release. But then the Department of Homeland Security appealed the decision, the winning decision. So we had to go to a higher court. And, in the meantime, again, he was released. And eventually we did receive a victory before the Board of Immigration Appeals. But, there was collateral consequences that had already been done because of his arrest and detention. The family lost their home, they lost their car, they lived in fear. And things that are still felt by this family to this day. And so I think it's so important that I think Murad mentioned, right, this doesn't undo everything, but it's a focus on due process. It's a focus on giving somebody dignity. And Kika mentioned, and it's so important, the Universal Representation Program does not focus on the merits. This is not a case that I would have taken if we were in a triage model. This was a case that I took because I was essentially a public defender for this client, and we fought the law and we won. And this person is back in our community, and our community is better for it. But it almost didn't happen. And so I think, just really important to focus on, the efforts to continue to grow this at the federal level, because there are challenges that have existed in us implementing this program, including capacity. Right? I was one attorney when we started this. We're three now. But, as we started to grow, we also needed the funding to grow. And was that going to be likely at the local level? I started to see issues with, politics getting involved in the way city and county funding work. And all of this was really brand new to me. And also seeing it, possibly even this funding slip away for this very, very important model. And that is why federal action here is so, so, so important, because it would be permanent funding to promote access to justice. And the need in Wisconsin overall as a state is greater than the need that exists in Dane County. And because of the way our funding was limited, I couldn't reach those individuals in Sauk County, in Milwaukee County, in Kenosha County, because I was serving only Dane County. So many people that we saw languishing in detention, but because of our limited funding, could not serve them. So the federal government really needs to respond here by funding universal representation, giving lawyers to people who are at risk of deportation, and access to the support, this very complicated system, and upholding the values of fairness and due process.
Thank you, Asa. So, Kika, I'm going to come back to you, and we're going to kind of keep unpacking a little more about how universal representation, when we're successful, will help further the efforts and complement sort of the bigger fights to end detention and systemic racism and stop immigration enforcement that is such a pervasive apparatus that we've all been working to dismantle for many, many years now. Can you talk about the interconnectedness of this campaign to other parts of the work that lift up and aspire for our ultimate vision of making sure that our communities have access to justice?
Sure. Thank you, Nicole. I'd say, I think, 4 key things. One is that we truly believe representation advances racial justice. I talked about the way that Black and Brown people are disproportionately and unfairly impacted by both the criminal legal system and the immigration system.
Kika, sorry to interrupt. Your audio is a little choppy. Do you mind starting over if possible?
Sure. Does that sound any better?
Not exactly.
No. Okay. Bear with me one quick second. Nicole, maybe you can go to somebody else and come back to me if I still sound bad.
Sure. I think I'll go to Murad, and same kind of question, Murad, like this bigger vision of all of us that we worked on in various capacities to basically uncouple this idea of, law enforcement's job is to, be working on immigration issues. We're working on systems change, culture change, and ultimately building racial equity across our countries. How do you see that your state and local work will roll up to the federal work and the bigger vision of advancing justice?
I think from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the Muslim ban that happened in 2017, our nation's immigration laws have been founded explicitly in racism and xenophobia. Universal representation, again, will not undo systemic injustice, but it does provide a bulwark while we work to reform and abolish the worst aspects of our immigration laws and mitigates bias from delivery of legal services. Let's not forget the work that we had to do in, just 5 years ago throughout the Trump presidency. And we did that as the New York Immigration Coalition in partnership with MPNA and our national partners like FIRM and VERA, but we really needed to focus on really defending and protecting our community. And what he's done is going to continue to impact our communities. He appointed over hundreds of immigration attorneys and had implemented more than 400 anti-immigrant policies. And then the near total shutdown of immigration courts during the pandemic, leading to the current record high backlog of cases awaiting adjudication. These consequences, even though he's been out of office, remain with us to this day. Universal representation is essential for our fight for immigrant justice and human rights. It's essential to keeping our families whole, our community stable, and our economy growing. And I think that this is just one piece of our fight, right? Our fight for immigrant justice isn't just about universal representation, but it's about also reforming our arcane and racist system that we currently have. It's also about providing a pathway for legalization to those who are currently undocumented in this state and actually having immigration laws that are fair and just. And I think there's a question that I know we're not there yet, but it did, trigger something in me when I read it, is that we can walk and chew gum. I think that our communities have been fighting for a long time. The last time we had any form of legalization was 35 years ago under a Republican presidency, President Reagan. And, the times have changed and our systems have just gotten worse for our communities. So I think the fight is ever present and we need to build and continue to build our community's power to demand the justice that our communities deserve. And I think that that is the piece that all of the work that we are doing helps us build towards. So I see universal representation as part of that arc and part of our fight for justice.
Thank you, Murad. And back to our sister Kika. Let's test that audio. I think, building off of this idea of, access to justice and, of course, being able to, in the process, as part of the continuum of this work, end detention and end systemic racism. Can you share more about sort of what are the pillars of this as we advance this campaign?
Yes, can you hear me better now?
Yes, it's a little grainy, but I think it'll work.
Okay, and if I still sound terrible, I think my colleague Melissa can call in and take over. She's also way more interesting than I am. But building up on what Murad said, look, I think there are connections between our work and the fight for racial justice, the fight for rights to asylum seekers, and also the fight to end detention. And let me just say a couple of things. I mentioned it already. Black and brown people are impacted by the criminal legal system and the immigration system. And because our model demands that everybody has a right to representation, what we're really looking at is having an impact on both the criminal legal system and the immigration system, and making sure that those who are usually marginalized in the system, in the justice system, Black and brown people, are fiercely represented by lawyers who will use every single tool that they have in partnership with advocates and grassroots organizations and impacted people to fight for justice. We know that having a lawyer, I said it already, it keeps people out of the detention system, right? 3.5 times more likely to get out of detention on bond, and you're 10 times more likely to prevail in court with a lawyer. And so we really also tackling this terrible system that we have that criminalizes people by putting them in detention. So we're really using lawyers and universal representation as a stealth way to also attack the detention system. Let me also share one statistic that I don't think very many people know about, and that is that the research shows that if you have a legal representation, 99% of those who have lawyers and are facing detention show up in court, right? So all of this nonsense that we hear from the government about how, these Black and brown people mostly have to be in detention because otherwise they will, escape and won't show up in court. That's, or we need to police Black and brown bodies by installing these surveillance systems that deeply oppress and police our bodies. Right? Those arguments fall out of the window when we can show that according to all of these credible research reports, what matters the most is that people have both access to justice and access to lawyers. And then the last thing I would say is that we really need to restore the protections that asylum seekers deserve and that are being denied. And part of the solution to that is making sure, right, that we also have lawyers available for people who have rights under our laws and international laws to seek asylum protections in the United States.
Thank you so much, Kika. I think, Laura, we're nearing toward midterms, and I think, of course, we're hearing all of the rhetoric around immigrants, and especially here in the Southwest and the Mountain West, and not so much where I'm sitting, but I know it'll be an even bigger conversation as we approach midterms and, of course, 2024. So, as a battleground state, given the recent victory, what does your victory teach us about what it will take to win universal representation more broadly?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, especially we start voting next week, and that's why I had to step away because the canvasser was ringing my doorbell. But I think what it shows is everything is local, and that's what matters. We see a lot of national polls that want us to, think the border's on the ballot box, and it's just not, because in that climate is how we were able to, raise the money in the legislature, get matching funds from the county government to be able to do this. And there was not significant pushback. No campaign is running to some of those same county commissioners who voted for it are now running. None of their opponents have brought it up. And so these national polls can say immigration is this or that. But what we know locally is, people support their communities. They want people to feel like they belong. They don't want a system that is unfairly set up to separate families. So Nevada is a battleground state with also the only Latina in the US Senate. And they're going to come after her and bring up issues of the border. But what our voters want and what people say at the doors is, they are talking about rent prices. They're talking about President Trump's fumbling of the COVID response and how that led to unnecessary job loss in our state. Yes, immigration is critically important, but immigrants and their families also care about kitchen table issues like the economy and strong schools and good education for their kids. So I think that it may be an issue for some people, but overall, it's something that's made our activist community happy. It's, of course, supported immigrant families, and we're always thankful for our legal community for stepping in too. But those national polls and those national pundits just don't have it right. The people on the ground and the voters and what they feel is what we should be focused on.
Thank you, Laura. I think kind of leaning back on New York, I was so happy to join Murad and the NYC team last month for our tour. And, when we talk about budgets in the social justice movement, we often refer to them as moral documents. And New York leads the way with investment in legal services and access to justice for so many families and people and community members in one of the most diverse and cities in the world. Can you share a little bit about your experience fighting for legal services and universal rep, and what are some of the key lessons that our colleagues across the country can learn from the battles that NYC and partners have led on the ground to fight for and protect these investments and the bigger vision?
Yeah, I think for us, our work has been really rooted in building community power and doing that through what keeps our folks and our families together. And I think under the Trump administration, prior to the Trump administration, New York City had already created its Immigration Legal Services Fund and was really thinking forward about how do we make sure that all New Yorkers, regardless of their immigration status, have the ability to thrive and not just survive in the city. And that's the piece that I think really resonates with most folks, and really being able to build up our support, not just with elected officials, but within community, so that we're able to move the pendulum forward. Everything from the initial investment in New York City for immigration legal services to the state investment in immigration legal services, it has really been, I think the winning strategies here are really investing in our community's leadership and their ability to tell their stories, being able to have folks who've gone through the system and have the experience of going through such a horrific system tell their story about how it's impacted their lives, their communities' lives, and everyone else. Because when someone gets detained or put into deportation proceedings, it doesn't just impact them. And I think that's the piece that most people don't quite frankly understand. And even when the act of detaining them occurs, right? And if it's an ICE raid or if it's just a workplace raid or wherever this is happening, there's also collateral impact, right? And that collateral is other human life that is also then getting pushed into the system. So for us, I think our local wins have been, and our state wins have been really based in the fact that our messaging around building community means that we bring in everyone to the table, and that we're not leaving anyone out to be on their own. And I think for us, it's been a really good strategy in thinking about how we continue to build the narrative, right? for us, Knife Up, the New York Family Unity Project, Access to Representation, we're currently running a campaign right now on limiting ICE enforcement and how the state participates within that in a campaign called New York for All. Our session ends in a couple of weeks, so we're kind of really pushing forward as hard as we can to try to get it done this year. And that bill would pretty much limit the state's ability to work with ICE on federal immigration enforcement. And that would really make the state really start reconsidering the investments that they are making, right? And what laws that they are passing, because we should outlaw private detention or state support of detention of immigrants in New York. And we should really be pushing forward into how we're rethinking we're re-envisioning what community safety looks like and doing it with the immigrant justice and the racial justice lens on, and making sure that we're not just talking about the immigration impacts or ICE's impacts, but we're also talking about local PD and how they treat Black and brown folks, how our communities who have historically been marginalized and vulnerable are even more vulnerable if they're Black immigrants who not only have to face a horrific immigration justice system and have incredibly bad odds in coming out of it, but they also have to face racial profiling. They also have to face police interactions that can lead them to the deportation pipeline. So I think for us, really investing in our membership and community leaders to make sure that they're able to lead this fight, make sure that they're able to tell their stories and really build up our power, which then builds up our collective power to then pressure and demand the changes we need to see at the local and state level.
Thank you, Murad. I'm going to wrap it up because I see we're getting close to time, but I do want to kick it to both Aisa and Kika as we're wrapping here. But Aisa, given that you're in Milwaukee, what message do you want to send to your colleagues there locally on getting engaged, on working in coalition, and deepening the impact and reach of Universal Rep there at the local level?
I think that right now in Wisconsin, looking at midterms coming up, looking at it being an election year around the governor's race, it's sort of a scary time for this sort of work to be happening, but we have to continue to push until the learning that we've had from this program here in Wisconsin. And Dane County is about an hour and a half from Milwaukee, but I think that Milwaukee is very much set up to expand this work in that area and really support this push for this federal legislation, and for people who want to get involved, support the local nonprofits that are doing the work. Show up. We had Dia Sin Latino, in Madison, supported by Voces de la Frontera, very recently. And PNA is doing a lot of wonderful work here in Wisconsin right now, supporting legal service providers and the work. And so it's happening. It's happening all around you. And connect with MPNA and PNA. Reach out to me, and we will make sure that you get looped in with this larger network that is really making this very strong push to make sure that we ensure due process for all, and that we make a strong impact in our community by keeping our communities safe.
Thank you, Aisa. I'm going to turn it to Kika. I'm just, couldn't be more proud to be in this campaign together with Vera Institute for Justice. We've done almost a decade of work together on this issue and advancing a bigger vision for justice. What's our call to action for the whole country that's tuning in to join us and kind of informed by the lessons learned by the leaders that joined us today?
Our call to action is simple: get involved. Get involved, sign up, become a sponsor, a supporter. If you want to get involved individually, you can do that as well. Check out our website, go to the MPNA website, go to Vera's website, look for information about our campaign. I want to also just quickly build off the incredibly powerful words from Aisa, Murad, and Laura, which is that we have to believe that we can achieve justice, and we have to remind ourselves of the times when we thought we could not achieve justice, and we somehow made the impossible possible. 5 years ago, there were just 2 deportation defense programs in the country. Today, there are almost 60. So what I would say to folks is get on the bus, come and join us, and let us fight for what we know that we can achieve and what our communities demand, and rightfully so.
Thank you so much, Kika. And we'll be leaning on all of you as we're advancing this campaign. I know it's going to take a lot of education for us to get our members of Congress on board with us, and we can do this together. So I'm thrilled that we'll be in partnership with each of you as we advance fairness to freedom, and as we're moving forward to set course for a movement for universal representation. Any closing thoughts? I'm going to start on the far left coast here with Laura joining us before we officially wrap.
Yeah, thanks again for having Nevada part of this conversation, since we are new to the universal representation game. But just I cannot stress enough the importance of organizing in coalition and bringing in your labor partners and all kinds of constituencies who all have skin in this game. And definitely thankful to the support of especially nonprofit attorneys who put so much into deportation defense and helping organization like Plan, who doesn't have staff attorneys. So definitely shout out to them and include them in your coalitions as well.
Amazing. Murad, final thoughts?
I think for this audience, I really can't see who else is in it, but join a campaign wherever you're based. And go to MPNA's website, go to VERA's website. There's a number of different ways that you can join and take action. If you're in New York, visit nyc.org and learn how you can engage in our campaigns. Join us in the fight. This is not our only fight. This is not just the immigrant community's fight. If you are truly someone who wants to deliver justice for all and allow people to live in dignity and with respect, then this is your fight too. And join our actions, join our fights, and invest in our work.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Murad. Ainisa, thank you for joining us, representing the great state of Wisconsin. That's the host site for the conference today. We are so grateful to No Studios for allowing us to come today and share more on advancing universal representation. I want to thank each of our panelists for joining us on this Saturday afternoon, sharing your insight, your knowledge, and your passion to advance justice for all in our communities. So with that, I will sign off on our session, and I thank you, each of you, for joining us today.